Welcome back to the Force and Freedom podcast. Last time I posed a question. What is Star Wars about? Or what does Star Wars mean? And I began to unpack my answer. Star Wars is about freedom. But I should point out that there have been a lot of other interpretations of Star Wars. You may have heard of some. One of the most common is that Star Wars is about the hero's journey. There was a scholar, his name was Joseph Campbell, and he was influenced by some psychologists who thought that myths contained deep truths about our psychology. So Campbell studied the myths of lots of different cultures, and he claimed to find a pattern that he said they all tend to share in common. He called this pattern the monomyth, or the hero's journey. And he said, the reason all these cultures have myths that contain this pattern is because their myths reflect universal psychological needs. Needs we may not even be aware of, because they're buried deep within our unconscious. He said that as we grow up, we all have to pass through similar stages of development. The hero's journey is that story of human development. It's a story of crisis and transformation that all humans have to pass through as they grow up. Now, George Lucas, the creator of Star Wars, was interested in mythology, and he read Joseph Campbell's work, and he wanted to make a myth for our time. That's what he said in interviews at the time. So the thought goes, Star Wars reflects universal features of human psychology. That's one view of what Star Wars means. Another view is that Star Wars is about the battle between good and evil. The thought is there's a conflict in the real world between good and evil. Maybe it's a conflict between good and evil people, or maybe just between the good and evil in each one of us. Star Wars dramatizes that conflict. It represents that conflict in a vivid way that resonates with us. Another interpretation is that Star Wars is about personal responsibility. This is the interpretation of Dale Pollock, author of Skywalking, The Life and Films of George Lucas. Pollock writes, the major theme in Star Wars, as in every Lucas film, is the acceptance of personal responsibility. What Lucas seems to be saying is that we can't run away from our calling or mission in life, but have a duty to do what is expected of us. Hard work, self-sacrifice, friendship, loyalty, and a commitment to a higher purpose. These are the tenets of Lucas's faith. And then another thought that I see in a lot of critics is that Star Wars is about making money. George Lucas wanted money so he could be independent of the studios, and Star Wars was a great way to do it. People who focus on this tend to think there isn't really anything interesting going on in Star Wars. It's just entertainment. It doesn't mean anything important. Now, I think there may be something right about most of these interpretations, and I don't think they have to be mutually exclusive. Star Wars can be about the hero's journey and about the fight between good and evil, and, as I'm arguing, about freedom. The assessment that I don't accept, though, is that Star Wars is just entertainment, that it doesn't mean anything interesting. As I started to argue last time, I think Star Wars is worth thinking about, and I think that there's a side of Star Wars that hasn't gotten the attention it deserves. Whatever else Star Wars is about, I think Star Wars is about freedom, and I'm going to try to convince you of that. Unfortunately, the thought that Star Wars is just entertainment, it doesn't mean anything important, seems to be the most prevalent assessment among film critics. And to illustrate this, I've pulled up a handful of reviews from 1977, the year when Star Wars came out. Vincent Canby of the New York Times wrote, Star Wars pretty much defines what most people mean when they speak of escapist entertainment. It isn't about anything at all in any serious way, though it is so beautifully and cheerfully done and so full of references to the literature of one's childhood that the escapism is of a particularly invigorating sort. Pete Hamill, no relation of Mark Hamill, wrote a review of Star Wars in the Chicago Tribune entitled, Star Wars, Dumb Good Times Here Again? It included this passage. This movie, which was written and directed by George Lucas, is this season's big dumb flick. That is to say, it's not about anything. It doesn't make you think, it doesn't preach, it does not in any way add to the knowledge of the human heart. It's just entertainment. You walk in off the street after a long wait in line, and for a couple of hours you are somewhere else, flying around the galaxy, watching white hats fight black hats. And maybe this movie is the truest indication that we have moved into another era of wonderful nonsense, as Westbrook Pegler once described the 1920s. Finally, Gene Siskel also wrote a review of Star Wars in the Chicago Tribune that year. It started with these lines. I'm sure the folks at 20th Century Fox were thrilled when Time magazine this week called Star Wars the year's best movie, but that kind of outlandish remark can hurt the film. Star Wars is not a great movie in the sense that it describes the human condition. It simply is a fun picture that will appeal to those who enjoy Buck Rogers-style adventures. What places it a sizable cut above the routine is its spectacular visual effects, the best since Stanley Kubrick's 2001. That's all it has in common with Kubrick film. There's no mysterious symbolism in Star Wars, although calling it the year's best movie might trigger image searching. That would be unfortunate, because its story is terribly simple. Now, I think Siskel is just dead wrong. And last time I started to make my case by interpreting some of the images in the first 2 minutes of Star Wars. But the point of this podcast really goes way beyond the kind of thing I covered in the first episode. What I want to show you is not just that Star Wars dramatizes the conflict between freedom and conformity, but that Star Wars really explores that problem in a nuanced way. The images of Star Wars don't just make the conflict vivid, they investigate the conflict. So rather than continue scene by scene analyzing images, I want to jump straight to an image that I think gets to the core of the threat to freedom, the Death Star. I'm sure there are a lot of ways you could interpret the Death Star's shape. It kind of looks like an eyeball, maybe suggesting that it's watching, maybe sort of a Big Brother feel. But let's set aside whatever associations we can make with the shape and consider an association that the film itself makes through a repeating pattern. When you watch the first scenes on board the Death Star, here's the pattern you see again and again. First, an establishing shot of the Death Star. Second, a scene involving a small sphere that looks a bit like the Death Star, as if to remind us that the scene is about the Death Star. And third, somewhere in connection with the Death Star and the sphere, some reference to fear. Now the first bit, an establishing shot of the Death Star, is a pretty standard way of introducing a scene. But the repeated inclusion of small spheres that look like the Death Star suggests that the film is trying to make a point. And the repeated references to fear seem to be the point. Now, just as a warning, some of these references to fear will come in the dialogue, and so my interpretation will rely on more than just the images. But my point in this podcast is not that the dialogue is unimportant in Star Wars, or that you can give a good interpretation of Star Wars without paying attention to the words in the script. My point is just that the images play a crucial role in expressing the meaning of the film. In this case, the images are a kind of guide to the words. The images are what helps you understand the meaning of the words. The first scene on board the Death Star is preceded by an establishing shot. 4 seconds of footage of the Death Star with the menacing sound of the Death Star theme playing in the soundtrack. As a Star Destroyer in the foreground flies away from the camera and towards the Death Star, it shrinks to a barely recognizable sparkle. The Star Destroyer was enormous, but the Death Star is orders of magnitude larger. We're then transported into a conference room. A handful of officers in Nazi-like uniforms are debating strategy around a large, round black table. In the center of the table is a shiny black sphere whose surface is only broken by what appears to be a set of thin metal bands around its equator. Now, we've just seen the Death Star, also a sphere with a distinctive pattern of bands around its equator. So we're primed to see this little sphere as a sort of representation of the Death Star. Of course, the resemblance is abstract, but it is, after all, in the middle of a conference room aboard the Death Star. The debate turns out to be about the danger posed by the Rebel Alliance. Commander Tagg is warning the group that the rebellion is gaining support in the Imperial Senate when Governor Tarkin and Darth Vader stride into the room. The camera begins to move around the table, keeping Tarkin and Vader constantly on the opposite side of the table as they walk around it to get to Tarkin's seat. It's as if the camera has suddenly been pulled into orbit around the model Death Star in the middle of the table. Now think about what it means to be pulled into orbit around the model Death Star in the middle of the table. What's happening here is that the Death Star is being compared to a real star. Stars are large celestial bodies that tend to draw objects into regular orbits around them, forming star systems. They create a kind of order. The Death Star is supposed to do the same thing for political organization. It exerts force on the various local systems, as Tarkin explains in this scene.
Fear will keep the local systems in line. Fear of this battle station.
The Death Star and a real star both create order. A real star creates order by its gravitational force on the planets, and the Death Star creates order by generating fear among the local systems. And it's the authorities with the power to use the Death Star that direct that fear. So it makes sense that the entrance of Tarkin and Vader is what draws us into orbit around the little black Death Star on the conference table. So it's not just the way things look that communicates the ideas of Star Wars. Even the camera's motion can communicate something about the ideas at work in the scene. Now, interestingly, Lucas wasn't actually the one who proposed making the room and the table round. That credit goes to John Barry. But Lucas saw something in it and kept it. Lucas said, John Barry decided he wanted to keep the round motif, so he made more round rooms in the Death Star. Intellectually, it's all wrong because of the fact that they're the enemy. The interiors should really be very angular, but it works. In other words, normally you would want angular interiors for the enemy because they look less comfortable, less welcoming, harsher. But in this case, the general sense of harshness is less important than the motif that the movie is generating, a motif that we're going to see again and again. The second Death Star scene is once again introduced by an establishing shot of the Death Star to the tune of the Death Star theme, this time with 3 TIE fighters screaming in the foreground. Inside the Death Star, Vader and 2 Imperial guards march into Leia's prison cell, followed by a black, humming spherical droid floating in the air. The droid has various terrifying gadgets poking out of it, and a peculiar strip of lights around its equator. Again, there are some differences between this droid and the Death Star, but a floating sphere with a stripe around the equator is just too similar to the Death Star for the resemblance to be an accident, especially when we're on board the Death Star and just barely saw a shot of it. Vader announces that the purpose of his visit is to discuss the location of the Rebel base. The camera focuses in on a syringe protruding from the droid's surface, and the humming of the droid intensifies. In the following shot, Leia gasps with fear. The thought is, Leia will betray the location of the Rebel base out of fear of the droid. It's the same idea Tarkin expressed in the last Death Star scene. When people are afraid of something you might do to them, they'll do what you say. People give up their freedom when they're scared. The third scene that fits this pattern is the one in which the Death Star blows up Alderaan. As usual, we begin with an establishing shot of the Death Star. Horns blare the sinister Death Star theme. The Death Star is in the foreground and darkly lit this time to make it look more menacing compared to the lighter, smaller Alderaan in the distance. This time, the small Death Star-like sphere doesn't show up right away. It comes in the next scene. We'll get to that in a minute. In the meantime, we don't need a reminder of the Death Star because the scene climaxes in shots of the actual Death Star blowing up Alderaan. And once again, the scene emphasizes that the purpose of the Death Star is to generate fear to take away freedom. Tarkin wants Leia to betray the location of the hidden Rebel base, and he's hoping that fear that the Death Star will blow up her home planet is going to get her to do it. But Tarkin isn't just aiming at controlling Leia. Even after he's gotten a location out of her, he blows up Alderaan anyway. Why? To make a demonstration of the Death Star's power, to send a message to the galaxy that they'd better keep in line. So in this scene, Tarkin is trying to use fear of the Death Star to control both Leia and the entire galaxy. The thought that fear can be used to control people is really nothing new. You see it happening in all sorts of movies, especially movies with villains. But what sets A New Hope apart from many of these movies is that it focuses on fear and control as the problem, rather than on the character who happens to be generating the fear. Darth Vader has gone down in film history as one of its greatest villains, but the focus in these scenes isn't Vader or even Tarkin. The problem that comes up again and again is fear and its power to undermine freedom. And that matters because while Vader and Tarkin aren't problems we face in our world, fear is all around us. So if this is a movie about fear and its relationship to freedom, maybe it's got something important to say to us. And indeed, I think we get some clues about what it might have to say to us in the very next scene. At this point, I think it should be no surprise that the next scene starts with a third small Death Star-like sphere. It's a remote that Luke is training with aboard the Millennium Falcon. The first shot of this scene is kind of complex. Luke is training on the left. In the middle, further back, Chewie and the droids are engaged with a game of holochess. And to the right, Obi-Wan is overseeing Luke's training. So the shot turns out to be a kind of sandwich. Obi-Wan on the right and Luke on the left are doing one thing, and Chewie and the droids nestled between them are doing something else. The scene itself is going to turn out to be a kind of sandwich. It starts with Luke's training and some conversation between Luke and Obi-Wan, then turns to the holochess match, and finally returns to the training. I don't think this sandwiching is a coincidence. Luke's training and the holochess match are about precisely the same themes. Let's start with the beginning of the scene. There's a little remote on the screen to give a visual echo of the Death Star. This time there are no lines around the sphere's equator, but it's kind of a Death Star gray, and it shoots lasers at Luke, right after we saw the Death Star shoot a laser at Alderaan. So again, it's hard not to see a resemblance. And sure enough, the scene immediately deals with fear, specifically the terror of the inhabitants of Alderaan that Obi-Wan senses, a terror that was in fact caused by the Death Star. After Obi-Wan explains the disturbance he felt, he encourages Luke to get back to his training, and the focus turns to holochess. Chewie is upset because R2 has taken one of his pieces.
He made a fair move. Screaming about it can't help you.
But then Han explains that screaming about it might in fact help.
Let him have it. It's not wise to upset a Wookiee.
Let's think carefully about this. 3PO was appealing to a standard of fairness when he said that screaming accomplishes nothing. Under a standard of fairness, the terms of engagement are set by the rules of the game that each freely agreed to. Those rules stipulate who can move which piece in which ways, so they limit the kind of control that Chewie has over R2's pieces. Chewie can strategically move his own pieces to try to make R2 move his pieces in certain ways, but Chewie can't directly move R2's pieces or tell R2 where to put them, and any frustration he feels over how R2 moves his pieces has no bearing on what R2 is free to do. Under a standard of fairness, as long as R2 sticks to the rules, Chewie has no legitimate complaint about what R2 does. But once the scream is properly understood as a threat, it's clear that Chewie is not appealing to a standard of fairness at all. He's trying to impose a different standard, different terms of engagement. The new rule he's adding is basically, if you win, I tear your arms out of their sockets. And that completely changes the stakes, and therefore the strategy.
I suggest a new strategy, R2. Let the Wookiee win.
In other words, Chewie completely changes the game. He turns a game of wits into a game of physical violence. But why not just play the game of physical violence with Chewie? Turn this into a wrestling match. Fear. Fear will keep the droids in line. Fear of getting their arms torn out of their sockets. In the holochess game, we're replaying in miniature the story of the Empire. Just as fear will keep the local systems in line, fear is supposed to keep R2 in line, to make him bow down and let the Wookiee win. Let me see if I can spell out the relationship between fear and freedom in a little more detail, starting with freedom. There's a way in which chess is always about struggling for control of your opponent, restricting your opponent's options. You block my pawn, so I can't move it where I'd like. But when we sit down to play a game of chess, we've agreed to the rules of the game. So even if you get the better of me, I'm not really unfree. At one level, I don't want you to move your piece there, because it causes me problems. But at another level, I do want you to move your piece there. In the first place, I want you to be able to move your piece there, because it's part of the rules of the game, and I agree to the rules of the game and want us to play by them. Not only that, I want you to do your best, because that's what will make this game satisfying. So if moving your piece right where I don't want it to go is your best, then there's a sense in which you're doing exactly what I want you to do. And so there's an important sense in which everything that's happening in the game, your moves and mine, are all in accordance with my will. And so I'm totally free. A similar thing can happen in everyday life. For example, suppose we're neighbors, and I've got tomatoes near the edge of my yard. You come along and put up a fence around your yard, and your fence puts my tomatoes in the shade. There's a sense in which I don't want you to put your fence there. It's blocking sunlight from my tomatoes. But whether I realize it or not, there's another sense in which it's important to me that you be able to put your fence there. The same principle that allows you to choose what you want to do with your yard allows me to choose what I want to do with my yard. It allows me to plant tomatoes, for example. And so while I wish that you had a different preference, that you didn't want to put your fence there, I want you to be able to do so. Any terms of engagement that denied you the right to put up your fence might deny me the right to plant tomatoes. Of course, we can imagine terms that allow tomatoes but no fences, or fences but no tomatoes, but the best terms will be terms that everyone can accept, because then everyone will voluntarily cooperate. And terms that are slanted against any party will be hard for that party to accept. This is a basic thought from Rousseau among other social contract thinkers. If we can all agree on the laws, the terms of engagement with one another, then we can all live freely together, because no matter what any of us does, as long as it conforms to the laws, it's something we've all agreed to. And since we've all agreed to it, it's not a violation of our freedom. And by the way, the title of my podcast, The Force and Freedom, comes from Rousseau's discussion of this idea. At the beginning of his book, The Social Contract, Rousseau sets the stage for this idea by posing a problem. People need each other, so they have to live together in society. But living together in society seems to require giving up control of our own lives. And that's a dangerous proposition. Rousseau puts it this way: since each man's force and freedom are the primary instruments of his self-preservation, how can he pledge them without harming himself and without neglecting the cares he owes himself? In other words, how can I interact with others without risking having my arms torn out of their sockets? The answer, Rousseau says, is to find a way to get laws we all agree on to govern our interactions, to set the terms of engagement. Now, I doubt that Lucas intended for the holochess game to be an illustration of social contract theory, but I do think that Chewie's threat is supposed to echo the issues about fear and freedom the film has been focused on. 3PO's appeal to fairness, based in the rules of the game, is the alternative to this, and social contract theory is a way of elaborating that appeal to fairness as it applies to government. So social contract theory can help us understand the threat fear poses to freedom. Basically, social contract theory is a way of trying to spell out the details, bring out what's implicit in C-3PO's appeal to fairness. The problem with fear is that it can be used to change the terms of engagement from ones we all agree to ones we don't all agree to. After Chewie's threat, R2 can't make his choices freely within the rules of the game. His choices are dictated to him by fear of a consequence of winning, having his arms torn out of their sockets. What was a game of wits becomes a game decided by physical strength. R2 never agreed to play on those terms, so now R2 is unfree. The key thought in this part of the scene is that when the terms we engage under are forced on us by fear, we lose our freedom. The scene now turns back to Luke's training. Luke's having a hard time with the remote. Obi-Wan suggests that Luke try the exercise with a helmet's blast shield covering his eyes so he can't see. The idea is for him to trust the Force, which seems to work. Luke manages to parry a series of shots. Meanwhile, Han and Obi-Wan are expressing their disagreements about the Force. Han calls it a hokey religion, says Luke's success is luck, says he prefers a blaster to a lightsaber. The key thing to notice here is that the remote Luke is fighting is a visual echo of the Death Star, a symbol of fear. So what we're seeing is Luke training how to fight fear. And he's training to fight it in the same scene with the holochess game, where fear and its threat to freedom were dramatized. And that confirms that this scene is about how to fight fear. So when Obi-Wan and Han debate Obi-Wan's suggested approach, they're debating what to do about fear when it threatens freedom. Han says, when there's a threat, grab your gun. We've already seen Han's strategy in the cantina with Greedo, at least in the theatrical version of the movie. Don't get scared when someone points a gun at you. Just shoot first. By contrast, Obi-Wan says, when someone points a gun at you, rethink your assumptions. Question how you see your opponent. Reach out with your feelings and get in touch with the larger world, and let that awareness of the larger world guide your actions. When someone threatens you, they want to change the terms of engagement. They want to change a game of wits into a game of violence, for example. They want to change debates in an imperial senate to frightened obedience. They want to change a reminder about a debt to Jabba into a long-anticipated execution. When Han fights fire with fire, he's trying to find a way to win on the new terms, and that means he's just accepting them. But in accepting the terms that others dictate to you, you've already lost your freedom. If you engage with the Empire on their terms, everything is decided by violence and threats of violence. And in the long run, that's a losing strategy, because the Empire has the most firepower. Obi-Wan's thought is, don't accept the terms others try to force on you. Don't take your cues from the person threatening you. Look deeper inside yourself. Look wider outside yourself. Find the bigger picture, and let it guide you to alternative terms. Don't be reactive. Don't just follow the motions of the remote. Anticipate. I've heard this last idea, the one about not just reacting, in some interviews with great defenders in basketball. They say a great defender doesn't just react really quickly to the player he's guarding. He doesn't just wait for the other player to make decisions. He takes control of the other player's options. The great defender positions himself to close off the options he doesn't like and encourage his opponent to take the options the defender prefers. He anticipates what his opponent will do, and sometimes he starts countering it before his opponent has even moved. If you wait until your opponent has made a move, you're giving your opponent the upper hand. Now, if that applies in basketball, where the rules are well established, think how much more it applies in contexts where there are no basic rules. One of my favorite real-life illustrations of the Jedi strategy of shifting the terms of engagement is from a game of Chinese chess a couple of my friends played. Ian was really good at Chinese chess, and Ben knew that if the game was going to be decided by who was best at Chinese chess, he was going to lose, so he needed some other strategy. And he noticed all of a sudden that there was a sacrifice he could make. And if he could just get Ian to take his sacrifice, he could get Ian in checkmate. But he also knew that Ian was very perceptive and he was unlikely to fall for it. So he decided to use some deception. He placed his piece in position to make the sacrifice, and he looked carefully for a long while from various angles with his finger on it. And then he took his finger off, waited a moment, and then groaned. And he pretended suddenly to have seen the danger, as if he had never noticed that Ian might take the piece. "How could I have been such an idiot?" he said. And Ian, being a nice guy, said, "Oh, it's okay, you can take your move back." And Ben said, No. I took my finger off." And Ian said, No, it's fine. And Ben said, "No, I'm not going to take it back, and then if I win, I have to admit that it's because you let me take a move back. Now, we're going to play by the rules." And all of this conversation about taking the piece back and all of Ian's efforts to be nice distracted Ian from noticing that he shouldn't take Ben's piece, because it would put him in a vulnerable position. So he finally took Ben's piece, and then Ben promptly put him in checkmate. Now, this isn't a case where fear changes the terms of engagement. But Ben saw that the terms of engagement didn't favor him, and so he used a clever trick, a bit of distraction, a bit of psychological warfare that could give him an advantage when strategically he was at a disadvantage. He did it all by the official rules of the game, but in a way he broke some unofficial rules of a friendly game of chess. Rules about good faith in conversation that Ian was clearly assuming. When Ben recognized that the terms of engagement were not going to get him what he wanted, he put down the blast shield and stopped looking at it solely with the eyes of a chess strategist, and started imagining other ways of engaging his opponent. Blind spots he could take advantage of, like Ian's being a good guy. In this episode, I've been trying to do two things. First, I've been adding to my case that the images of Star Wars consistently refer to a problem about freedom. My claim was that Lucas focuses our attention on the threat fear poses to freedom by a pattern of shots of the Death Star, shots of small spheres resembling the Death Star, and references to fear. I've tried to show that the holochess match spells this problem out more explicitly. My second task has been to show that Star Wars does more than dramatize this problem. It explores it. And I'm still just getting started on that task, but I've already shown how we can see Han and Obi-Wan's debate about the Force as a debate about how to deal with fear. We'll get to consider each of their approaches in action next time. In the meantime, if you like the podcast, hit the subscribe button, and think about whether there's a Star Wars fan in your life who might like to hear about it. May the Force be with you.